In the first presentation on Richard Dawkins, replying to Richard Dawkins' critique of St. Thomas Aquinas' arguments for the existence of God, I spent most of the time just trying to explain Aquinas' first way that he uses to argue for God. I'm not going to pay attention to the second and third arguments for sake of time. They're not exactly identical to the first argument, as Dawkins claims, but they do bear a great deal of similarity in the structure of the argument. I think there's a more elaborate explanation of what Aquinas is doing in these five arguments, but that need not deter us at present. What Dawkins then does, after he briefly summarizes the first three ways that Aquinas argues for God, he then goes on to offer some criticisms. The first criticism that he makes is to say the following. He says all three of these arguments rely upon the idea of a regress and invoke God to terminate it. The next sentence is one that intrigues me. He says, they make the entirely unwarranted assumption that God himself is immune to the regress. They make the entirely unwarranted assumption that God is immune to the regress. This is one of the most confusing sentences in Dawkins' response. And the reason why is because of the word assumption. The argument that Aquinas makes here does not assume that God is immune to the regress. What it does is it concludes to God being the resolution of the regress of causal explanations. I hope you see that. If you go back and look at the first presentation I gave on Dawkins, or on Aquinas' argument for God, you'll see that we didn't talk about God until we got to the end of the argument. We first started talking about motion, the experience of becoming, or the experience of things coming to be that weren't before. At the conclusion of the argument, we saw that God, or the self-existent, uncaused source and explanation of everything else, which is what we mean by God, that God is the conclusion of the argument, not an assumption in the argument. What we saw was that we're left with one of two explanations of motion. Either that motion is an endless or infinite series of dependent causal relationships where everything depends upon yet something else, but that it never comes to an end, that there is an infinite number of dependent things one upon the other with ultimately nothing to ground the whole series of dependent things. That's option number one. For Aquinas, that's irrational. To think that there's an infinite number of things upon which this moment depends with nothing to ultimately ground it is nonsensical, because you can't ever finish an infinite number of things that depend simultaneously one upon the other. Now, Dawkins, again here, says that this is an assumption, it's an unwarranted assumption that God is immune to the regress. To the contrary, Aquinas concludes that God must be immune to the regress, because if God were not immune to the regress, then we don't have an explanation. And that leads us to the second of the two possibilities here. To explain becoming, we must have some supreme being or reality upon which all motion depends. And that being, that reality upon which everything depends, must itself be the reason or the ultimate explanation of the regress of dependent causal relationships. And therefore, by definition, must transcend the regress. But this is not an assumption, it is a conclusion of the argument. It is required by the argument because the only other alternative is the irrational proposal that there's no ultimate explanation. Now, you may not like his explanation, or you may disagree with Aquinas, but I don't think you can accuse him of simply assuming that this is the case. Well, where does he go from there? He continues on and criticizes Aquinas this way. He says, even if we allow the dubious luxury of arbitrarily conjuring up a terminator to an infinite regress and giving it a name simply because we need one, there is absolutely no reason to endow that terminator with any of the properties normally ascribed to God. And then he lists a series of them, beginning with omnipotence and then omniscience and goodness, creativity of design, and so on. This is another confusing statement that Dawkins makes. If you take Aquinas' work, the Summa Theology, in which he presents these five arguments for God, what Dawkins is quoting here, if you take that book and you look at the page where it presents the five arguments that he gives for God, and then you flip over to the next page, you'll see that it begins a series of articles in which Aquinas does exactly what Dawkins says can't be done. he walks through a series of divine attributes in one way or another, including every one of them that Dawkins presents here, and presents a rational argument in defense, or arguments, oftentimes numerous arguments, in support of the very attributes that Dawkins is proposing here. Let's just take one for the sake of discussion. We could take all of these, but I'll just take one of them to show how Aquinas might do this. The first of the attributes that Dawkins says cannot be shown, or that he says there's absolutely no reason to ascribe the terminator of the regress with these attributes. The first one is omnipotence, that God has all power. The response that I would give to this is, first of all, is to define what we mean by all power. Omnipotence means that God's power is unconstrained or not confined by any sort of restraining or restricting power or force or reality. My power, for example, is limited by a variety of things. I'm limited in energy, I'm limited by my body, I'm limited by space, I'm limited by gravity, I'm limited by all kinds of things. But the first reality obviously has the power to produce all of the effects in this world, but because the first reality, that is the ultimate explanation of all motion, if all motion depends on this first mover or this first reality, then there is nothing that exists in the world of changing things, there is nothing that exists that in any way is a rival to or a limiting force on the power of God. In other words, nothing exists except what God wills to exist. And if nothing but what God wills to exist exists, then there is nothing outside of God that is confining or constraining or limiting on him exercising his will. The only thing that would in any sense limit what God does is his own will. In other words, God's will and what God determines will be done is what God does. In other words, if God's essence and God's nature determines that something is to be done, there is nothing outside of him, nothing that restricts or limits his power. That's what we mean by omnipotence, is that there is nothing that confines or constrains or limits what God can do. God wills to do it, it is done. There's nothing to confine him. So if that's what we mean by omnipotence, then that logically follows from God being the first reality that explains all dependent realities, but nothing exists besides God, no becoming, no changing world exists besides what God wills to exist, and therefore there is no limiting power outside of God to say what he can and can't do. Dawkins goes on to say, he makes the assertion and tries to argue for it, that there is an inability to reconcile certain attributes of God. For example, God's omnipotence and God's omniscience. If God can do whatever he wants to do, but yet God knows everything, doesn't God's knowledge limit his exercise of power? In other words, if I know that I'm going to do something tomorrow, let's say I have all knowledge, and I know that tomorrow I'm going to do a certain act, doesn't my knowledge of what I'm going to do tomorrow limit my exercise of power? Because I know I'm going to do this act tomorrow, that constrains my power. I can't do otherwise than what I'm going to do tomorrow. So God's knowledge of what he does limits his exercise of power. Aquinas, I don't think, would be very impressed by this at all. For Aquinas, he sees our discussion of God's attributes as being an expression of the limitations of our mind. In God, all of these attributes are one. We think about them distinctly. There's a long explanation behind this. Aquinas thinks that we see things in a sort of discursive way, where we move back and forth between incomplete thoughts. In God, all those things that we see discursively and limitedly are almost like the various colors in the light spectrum as they come through a prism. The light itself, the pure white light, when it goes through the prism, sort of shows up in a series of rainbow colors. So it is here. When we think of the attributes of God, they appear to be different. There's various different attributes of God. But what Aquinas would say is that these various attributes of God, as we experience them, in God are one. Therefore, in God, his omniscience is in fact an expression of his power. And an expression of God's power is his knowledge of everything. And God's knowledge of everything is in fact an expression of his power. In other words, to set these attributes of God up in opposition to one another is completely contrary to the very nature of God, which is to be fundamentally simple. That is, God is not divisible into parts or attributes that are separable from one another. God's omniscience is in fact his omnipotence, and his omnipotence is his omniscience, and so on with the other attributes. So the attempt to try to set these things up in opposition to each other because of the conceptual conundrums that we might create for ourselves based on the experience of time. That's another problem here with Dawkins' argument, is that if you put together God's omniscience and God's omnipotence with God's immutability and God's timelessness, if you put all those attributes together, then some of these conundrums that he had begin to disappear because the understanding of one attribute is constrained by or limited by, or in various ways put into a different context by the understanding of the other attributes. In any case, none of these things show that the notion of God is incoherent. It simply shows that the weakness of our understanding to fully comprehend what all of the attributes of God mean. That's an important topic, and perhaps we can explore that again. But I'll bring this section to a close with that observation. What we'll do in the next presentation is look at his final observations regarding the first argument of Aquinas.